You are listening to the Foreign Policy Focus podcast.
We cannot wait for the final proof. The smoking gun could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
Haven't you driven enough people from their homes already? Bulldoze their villages, seize their property under laws they had no part in making.
Now working in Libya with friends and allies, we've demonstrated what collective action can achieve in the 21st century.
Now the host of the show, Kyle Ansel.
This is episode 362 of the Foreign Policy Focus podcast. The big news on today's show is the two cargo ships that were attacked in the Gulf of Oman. This body of water sits between Iran and the Arabian Peninsula. And for those of you consistent listeners of the show, knowing what's going on in that region, can imagine there's an awful lot of war hawks out there trying to capitalize on this event. So I'll do my best to set the record straight there. I have some updates on the humanitarian crisis in Yemen, which is seeing another round of cholera outbreak, and then some positive news in the relationship between Donald Trump and Kim Jong-un and the push towards making some kind of deal to bring a more peaceful situation to the Korean Peninsula. Please take the time to share the show or recommend it to a friend. This is the way the show grows, is by all of you getting out there and clicking the share button, telling people, hey, this is a really good foreign policy podcast. I mean, I'm talking about this on the show today. This is, I think, the biggest advantage that libertarians should have. At the end of the day, you know, people could say what they want about other issues, but we are 100% right on foreign policy. And in a lot of cases, everybody agrees. Everybody knows the Iraq war was completely stupid and they lied us into that, right? That was described by many people as one of the biggest blunders of the 21st century so far. And what the libertarians advocate, a non-interventionist foreign policy, is right on what would have made that not happen. So let's get libertarians informed about foreign policy because I really think that could help convert people to being libertarians, part of the reason why I do this whole show. So go to the Libertarian Institute, find the show, share the show from there. It's featured on the homepage. And if you really like it, think about donating to the show. I'm doing a new Patreon either live stream or Google Hangout thing where I'll take questions, or you'll be able to join the chat live and either ask me questions or make comments, and maybe I'll upload it. If it's really good, maybe I could upload it as an episode, but just gonna do one at first. I see a lot of other podcast hosts doing this, so I imagine this means is because people enjoy, doing these kind of live stream features, and I hope you do too, and I hope some people show up and it'll encourage others to donate. So patreon.com/foreign policy focus for that. So first up on today's show is Donald Trump apparently received a letter from Kim Jong-un. Now, in one sense, I think it's unfortunate that the major headline grabber here and what the first few paragraphs of every article on this focus on is that Donald Trump called this beautiful. And so they're, going, oh, Donald Trump calls a letter from a mean, nasty dictator beautiful. Isn't he so awful? Look, he loves, Duterte and Putin and all the mean, evil dictators of the world. And so this kind of just feeds into all the left-wing propaganda against Trump. And there is a lot of, kind of from the MSNBC and CNN crowd. A lot of that is just propaganda and Trump hatred and not legitimate reasons to hate the guy, which there are some. And, there's real reporting being done by real left-wing outlets and journalists that go through and they expose corruption in the Trump administration and, a lot of times war crimes, what we're talking about a lot on the show here. I do think this is a case where Trump plays the media, actually, though, because the American people have to know that Kim Jong-un has nuclear weapons. And while I'm not sure if the North Koreans could deliver those weapons to the United States, there's a lot of evidence that, suggests that, they maybe could launch an ICBM in our direction. I'm not sure what, confidence they have that would actually hit anything or how guided that ICBM would be, if it would survive re-entry and everything. But there is that threat. There's also the threat of attacking either U.S. interests or U.S. allies in the region. Of course, South Korea, Japan, where there's major U.S. bases and tens of thousands of Americans in both of those countries. Guam and Hawaii are closer than mainland United States. So there are targets for North Korea should they carry this out. And so knowing that as an American, I would much rather Trump be calling this letter he's receiving from Kim Jong-un beautiful than threatening fire and fury because one makes me safe and one doesn't. Trump and Kim Jong-un are getting along. They have no reason to bomb each other. Nobody in the world believes that North Korea could in any way win any kind of conflict versus the United States, and that their nuclear weapons are just there as a deterrent in case the United States strikes first, at least then they could, threaten and potentially kill some Americans in response. So if Donald Trump can manage to get along with Kim Jong-un, then Americans are safe from the North Korean threat, and woohoo, isn't this a great thing? And even if they try to spin it as, oh, evil, stupid Trump, I hope the American people know better. And I do think they do on this issue. I think this will be a winner for Trump in 2020 if he's able to move forward with more talks with Kim Jong-un and potentially signing an agreement. Upcoming, we have Donald Trump meeting with the South Korean President Moon Jae-in at the G20 summit in Japan. I think that's coming up within the next month. This is also where Trump is supposed to decide if he's going to put sanctions or not on, I believe, both Turkey and China at this summit. So it'll be a busy time for Donald Trump. Anytime that the South Koreans have had a lot of influence in the peace process, it seems to be a boon for peace. Now, maybe the South Koreans are just overstating the North Koreans' willingness to engage in this talks, or it's that, the Americans kind of go along with it when they talk to the South Koreans, but over time, Donald Trump gets swayed by his hawkish advisors like Pompeo and John Bolton into taking stricter, more aggressive positions that the North Koreans outright say, no, these are red lines, we're not going to take them. I also read a couple of reports that there's some White House officials saying that there's a potential third summit between Trump and Un. Hopefully this happens, but I do think there needs to be probably some time between now and then for the diplomatic process to start to build in the right direction again, and to have some, language already worked out on the table to make sure the U.S. doesn't show up with a deal that the North Koreans won't sign again. The other story here is that Donald Trump said that he doesn't want to use CIA informants against North Korea. This is in response to the half-brother of Kim Jong-un apparently being something of a CIA asset or informant at one point. Of course, he was assassinated in Malaysia. And as I said, I believe on the last show, he was potentially going to meet a CIA officer on that trip. Now, the media, I think, again, is way overplaying this. In this case, it may work better with the people, though, because this is a little bit more of a nuanced point. Donald Trump saying that he's not going to use the CIA against North Korea may be something that, Kim Jong-un finds as reassuring. Libertarians are not shocked by the fact that the CIA has overthrown a lot of governments during its time, and just maybe it's not impossible that they would try to pit somebody within the North Korean government, tell them that if they could overthrow Kim Jong-un, they would recognize them as the official leaders of that government, and then supply that guy with weapons and assets and money and technology needed to carry out that coup plot. I mean, this is, I think, very realistic and something that Kim Jong-un is probably worried about, and he would be foolish not to be worried about that, to be quite honest, with the American CIA track record. And so I think that's probably what Donald Trump is trying to refer to when he says he's not going to use CIA assets against North Korea. And that, like I said, could be something that is reassuring to the North Koreans going into talks, which, talks have to be done. Something has to be done here because we're talking about, a Cold War kind of standoff between the U.S. and North Korea, especially when you have this amazing political opportunity in South Korea with the government so willing to work and support the North Koreans and kind of coming in from the cold here. Whereas, the narrative from the never Trumpers and the typical media types is, oh my God, Donald Trump isn't going to use any intelligence against North Korea. What a fool. He's just going to go in blind and believe everything that Kim Jong-un says. I suppose everybody who's not going to vote for Donald Trump probably believes that narrative. Everybody who's going to vote for Donald Trump knows that he's not that stupid and isn't going to do that. Onto this incident in the Gulf of Oman where 2 cargo ships were attacked. I got this article from Moon of Alabama, which I find to be the best breakdown of it so far. There's a ton of people, as you would expect with this, getting way out in front of themselves, talking about they know who did it and this group is potentially responsible. I'll just go ahead and spoil this for you guys. I'm not going to say who's responsible here or really be able to rule anybody out, because that's just where we are so far in the investigation and reporting into this. What we had is 2 ships sailing in the Gulf of Oman. One was a Marshall Islands flagged ship sailing from the UAE to Taiwan, and the other one was a Panama flagged ship sailing from Saudi Arabia to Singapore. Both of these ships were carrying petrochemicals, and not being an expert in this whatsoever, we'll just briefly explain this as meaning chemicals that are somehow used in the production of oil. I don't know really where in that production line, but I know it's important to it. And Iran was recently sanctioned on petrochemicals. As I talked about in the past on the show, the Japanese leader traveled to Iran and met with, I believe, the Ayatollah, Rouhani. I don't know if he met with the Ayatollah, but after that, he went back to Japan and went along with the U.S. petrochemical sanctions on Iran. I guess this is something that could really hurt Iran being able to produce petrochemicals, and in the past, hawks in the Iranian government have made threats that if Iran isn't able to, import or export petrochemicals, nobody else should be either. And as far as I could tell, that's really, at this point, all we know. The attack was closer to the Iran coastline than the Oman coastline. This is, of course, a body of water that flows into the Strait of Hormuz and then the Persian Gulf. I think it was some distance from the Emirates and their port that was the host of the 4 ships that were attacked last month. Hawks like to beat the war drums on this, and I think there's even, probably some people on our side of the whole spectrum and movement, the Doves, getting out there and saying, oh, this definitely wasn't Iran. I'm not saying it was. I'm not saying it wasn't. I'm just saying that there's really no evidence either way so far. It doesn't seem like Iran would have a whole lot of incentive, except for the fact that that threat was carried out. I think if they did this, it's going to bring a lot of condemnation from the international community, and it could be an excuse like for the European Union and other countries to exit the Iran nuclear agreement. And then I think that would bring them putting sanctions back on Iran and buying less products from them, hurting the Iranian economy. That's why I think Iran probably won't do this. Things I would be skeptical of is when either the Houthis are blamed for this or Hezbollah. This is a far way away from either of those two countries. It could very possibly be separatist factions within Iran, like the MEK or other groups who have carried out terrorist-like activities in the past. And remember that Saudi Arabia and the UAE are carrying out a genocidal war in Yemen right now. And so it doesn't even have to be necessarily an organized state group or anything like that. There's a lot of reason to hate these two countries and want to hurt their financial assets. There's some analysis going in here that is above my head on how this is impacting oil markets. Go to somebody who knows more about economics for that side of it, because I really don't get how all this works and why it works the way it does. But that is another possible explanation for why this attack happened. I mean, when you look at how big the world oil economy is, being able to sway that market by a couple points probably brings in an awful lot, or could potentially bring in an awful lot of money. Turkey claims to kill 10 Syrian Kurds inside of Syria in response for a Turkish soldier being killed. All these reports come from either the Turkish government or Turkish state media, so there's obviously that kind of bias when you're reporting on it here. But I do think it's interesting that Turkey is still carrying out military operations inside of Syria against the U.S.-backed Syrian Kurds. Turkey is also asserting that they're going to continue with the planned purchase of the S-400 missile system from Russia. The humanitarian crisis in Yemen looking bad again on the cholera front. So far in 2019, over 1,100 people have died of cholera in Yemen. This is, of course, a very easily treated, viral infection where a person basically just needs fluids and, get the young and the old to the hospital, quickly give them fluids and they live. But unfortunately, the 4-year brutal bombing campaign of Yemen has devastated the infrastructure of the country so much that people can't easily get to the hospital. The blockade of the country has absolutely destroyed the living conditions of the people. So they really have to consider, can we buy food or can we get the cholera treatment for one of our children? These are real crises that people are facing right now. And because of that, a lot of people are dying of a just very easily treatable condition. And, a lot of these people, like I said, are the children. Now, of course, the reason cholera is spreading is also because of the air war and the blockade of the country. The air war damaged a lot of the civilian infrastructure, wells, water treatment facilities, that people need, to be able to easily get clean water. On top of that, Saudi Arabia isn't allowing in new, water pumps and stuff like that. And at the same time, they're not or have delayed, aid ships that are carrying things like chlorine tablets that you drop in water to help sanitize it. So it's awful in Yemen. I mean, I don't know how else to say it. And the worst part about it, of course, is the U.S. government is ambivalent towards Yemen. And if any interest at all, it's actually against the Saudi side, because that's where all the Al-Qaeda fighters are lining up to fight for is the Saudi side and the side of the UAE. We're really taking the side against the interests of the American people here. And it's not good. It doesn't need to happen. This war could end really quickly if Donald Trump will pull the plug on it and just say, absolutely, we're not supporting Saudi Arabia on this anymore. We're going to condemn them, on the international stage. Hey, these guys are committing a genocide here. They're blockading a country that can't fight back, and, little children are starving to death because of it. I also saw reports that Yemen carried out a cruise missile attack. This would be, I think, a pretty significant increase in Yemeni military technology. In the past, they've launched ballistic missiles against Saudi targets, and these were converted Scud missiles. From my understanding, cruise missiles most of the time are like more advanced versions of ballistic missiles. I think ballistic missiles are ones that kind of go up and down. They shoot straight up in the air, and then they use GPS locators and gravity to come down and hit the target with the warhead. Whereas a cruise missile is going to fly much lower, and I think is like loaded up with a plane engine or a jet engine, and is propelled the whole way by that force and not by gravity. A couple of people said that this cruise missile was of Iranian design. No confirmation on this yet. All reporting has come from state sources. I wait to see some weapons experts, maybe look for analysis from IHS Janes or Scott Ritter on what kind of technology the Houthis are using and if this is Iranian technology or not. All right, last up here. I want to talk a little bit about libertarianism and the fact that libertarians should constantly be winning arguments. And I know libertarians love to win arguments online about foreign policy, and that libertarians have absolutely the best foreign policy, and that's why everybody should be libertarian. But instead, it seems like libertarians are much more interested in focusing on, internal arguments about either immigration or abortion, little nuanced things about property rights. And while this is certainly more important than the other stuff, economics, is one of the top on the list. Now, there are a lot of libertarians out there who mainly care about the war on drugs and the cops and the immoral justice and prison system. And good for you guys too, because, that's right up there with the most important things. I just think the foreign policy should be such a clear winner for libertarians. I can never really understand why we don't focus on it more. One interesting thing is, unlike with Social Security or even Obamacare, the Iraq War is a failure. Other than somebody like John Bolton, completely on the insane kooky fringe here, nobody believes that the Iraq War was a good idea. Nobody, everybody believes that we were lied into the Iraq War. We know that now, that we were lied into the Iraq War, that Saddam Hussein did not have weapons of mass destruction. They could not find them. He did not have them. This is a real problem for those who advocate for the war state, and we should constantly be beating people over the head with it. We killed 1 million Iranians. People talk about how this healthcare system is going to save so many lives. We're talking about 1 million people that were killed in this conflict, and who knows how many in the violence created since. This kind of goes up to the Sunni Shia civil war that was going on in Iraq after the fall of Saddam Hussein, but since then, we essentially had another one with the rise of ISIS in the complete destruction of long-standing Iraqi cities like Mosul and Ramadi, and how much of the problems of the Iraq war spread into Syria, where hundreds of thousands of people have died. It seems very unlikely that that war ends up like it does without the Iraq war happening in 2003. And of course, there's a lot of U.S. involvement in the meantime in Libya and just directly in Syria through the CIA program, where John Brennan was arming, the CIA was arming and training groups of Syrian rebels that were tied or just straight up jihadist groups. Jihadist fighters take a different name, they go train with a different group, and then they come back with U.S. made weapons. Or they just, the jihadist fighters wait till the Americans arm up some other militia, and then they point their guns at them and they say, give us all of your American weapons, or they buy them off of them. So anyways, the U.S. really helped all that go down in Syria. And like I said, hundreds of thousands of dead there too. I mean, we're talking about millions of people since 9/11 killed in the Middle East. And I mean, isn't that just the greatest moral catastrophe? Look at what's going on in Yemen. Hundreds of thousands of people starving to death. That should be, one of those a priori things. You have to accept libertarianism because you have to accept a non-interventionist foreign policy. And then from there, you could get into arguments about why free market governments are less likely for war than communist governments and how that's going to help everything out. But, the non-interventionist argument should be easy. It's a central, principle in libertarianism. I mean, our guy, Ron Paul, has been saying this in Congress for years. He's been right on it all for years. So go find some Ron Paul speeches and say, hey, look, back in the 90s, this guy was saying that a terrorist attack was going to happen in the United States because of what we were doing to the Iraqis there. Because Madeleine Albright was on TV saying we starved 500,000 of their children to death and it was worth it. So I don't know exactly what it's going to take to get libertarians better on foreign policy and to make them care more about foreign policy. But it's something that would, I think, really be healthy and great for the libertarian movement. Imagine if rather than Gary Johnson saying, what is Aleppo, in one of the most iconic libertarian moments now ever to the mainstream, you tell people that you're a libertarian. You know how many of them have asked me, what is Aleppo, as a joke to my face? They think libertarians are idiots who know nothing about foreign policy, when in reality, we should be the best educated because, one of our great leaders is Ron Paul, one of the greatest guys on foreign policy, probably, in the history of the U.S. Congress. I know I get a little ranty and tangential here, but I did want to talk about, these property rights libertarians real quick too. Because I had an interaction on Facebook that really rubbed me the wrong way, where somebody spray painted Yemen in red on a Lockheed Martin sign, and a libertarian friend of mine, who's actually a former guest on the show, so I'll mention her name, Tricia Stewart, shared it. And I was like, oh, this is awesome. Like, these guys are killing Yemen. So yeah, spray paint Yemen up on their sign and made people know that, hey, Lockheed Martin gets their money from the blood of the Yemeni people. That's what's happening right now. Saudi Arabia wants to kill Yemenis, and Lockheed Martin is helping to lobby Congress to pay think tanks to make this all happen. And they go over there and blow Yemeni children to pieces. This is the situation. And they're like, oh, well, it's a property rights violation to spray paint the sign. Now, we're talking about genocide in Yemen and maybe $50 of property damage in the United States. And these people, rather than saying, yeah, like this is a terrible thing happening in Yemen, all they want to do is talk about the property rights violation and how it's so stupid. It's so ridiculous. But this is, I think, one of the biggest downsides of the libertarian movement is that it just makes it completely unrelatable to everybody else. Because everybody else hears us talking about how, oh, all these terrible things are going on in U.S. foreign policy. But as soon as anybody stands up to one of the weapons makers, which, loosely you could call private property. I mean, Lockheed Martin is pretty much just a division of the Pentagon at this point, except, there's some private ownership. That way it enriches the owners and the connected officials at the expense of the rest of us. Yeah, so anyways, share the podcast with libertarians and tell libertarians get better on foreign policy, and then you'll win every argument ever. Nobody could be a libertarian on foreign policy. Start with this, and, maybe we'll start to change some minds here and end some wars or something one of these days. Anyways, thanks for listening to the show. libertarianinstitute.org, Twitter at KYAAALE, patreon.com/foreignpolicyfocus.